Welcome to Part 7, Finishing the Cabinet. Hello everyone and welcome back to the build. I apologize for dragging my feet on getting this posted. I've been a bit conflicted on what to do with it. As I've been dragging parts out of storage, I found out that I was missing part of my wiring harness for the power supplies. And after testing my Zookeeper board, I also had problems with the board as well. While I'm a purist at heart and I try to go with original hardware whenever I can, in this situation I decided to go with the J-Rock board instead. I still have the intent to get the original Zookeeper parts back in the machine eventually as well. So as a result, I'm not going to be focusing too much on the actual install of the boards and the power and wiring, and mainly focusing on finishing up the cabinet. So with all those disclaimers out of the way, let me start back on the narration of what I'm doing here in the background. So here we've roughed up the melamine, getting ready to apply the side art. This was done with 80 grit sandpaper. It really seems to depend on the quality of the vinyl that you get. Some of it seems to stick to everything, some of it doesn't seem to stick as well. I do this on everything before I wind up applying vinyl. The real important thing here is to make sure that you're cleaning up all your dust afterwards with it. You want to make sure that there's no debris left behind, that you have a nice clean surface to apply your side art to. Let me just interrupt here for a quick note. When I apply side art, I use the wet method. When I'm doing this, I'm also using rapid tack. There are lots of other solutions out there that people make from home blends with dish soap and water and whatnot. From my perspective, if you're going to spend a couple $100s on side art, spending the $12 or $15 for the right application solution is not a big deal. So I always wind up using rapid tack. So here I'm using the rapid tack as a cleaning solution. You don't want to be using Windex or something else to do it. It may interact with the application fluid. So I use it as a cleaning solution to make sure I got all the debris off before I start applying the side art. Now we're starting to get ready to actually apply our side art. Alignment and prep is really key for what's going on. We basically have our clamps here, you'll see, to be able to lock the side art in position with it, and that we can then start making our really small, intricate adjustments to the side art. Here you'll see I'm notching the side art. This is basically so I can get the clips in to fold over the material without actually bending the vinyl while I'm doing the application on it. Also note that I'm always putting paper towels between the clips and the side art. If you don't do this, there's a chance of you possibly scraping the material. Once you think you have everything in position, basically you can then rub your finger around the edge of it and create a small crease, and then you can get a good adjustment on whether the front and the back match and all your edges are squared up. Once that is done and correct, I usually then wind up trimming the excess material off that I'm not going to need for installation. When I apply the side art, I usually like to start at the bottom, so I'll fold it over and then thoroughly saturate the material and let it sit for a while. So I missed a clip here and I apologize for that. But basically I like to try and lock down the bottom of the cabinet first with the vinyl installation with it. Once that's done, you wind up moving your clamps up with the paper towels as well, and then you wind up working the rest of the vinyl install in sections. Just a note, it is bad to do creases as you see here in the vinyl. The advantage of having good high quality vinyl is that it's much more resistant to actually turning into a crease in the material. So a lot of the times you can still rub it out and the crease magically disappears if you have good material to work with to start. As you're working through the vinyl, you need to make sure that you're keeping your area as clean as you can with it. Any debris or anything that shows up on the vinyl is going to show up as a bump afterwards with it. The other wonderful thing about this material is it seems like the solution gets absorbed through the vinyl. So even if you have a little bit of material, a little bit of solution left over afterwards with it, it seems to disappear over the next day as the material dries. And basically it's just rinse and repeat until you have everything applied to the top. You'll also see that I'm applying with a squeegee on the back side of the vinyl or the surface of the vinyl. And this is basically to push the contact solution towards the edges so I don't wind up having any bubbles in the material as I'm going through and doing the application. And now we get to go and see me do the same process again on the second side. As I've kind of mentioned throughout this whole project, especially with the side art, prep is key to trying to get everything right and done correctly the first time. In this sample, we're using melamine as the build material for the cabinet. And where melamine really excels at is application of full side art. Lots of downsides to the material in general, but this is really where it excels. If you're not using melamine for it, the prep for your sanding and your priming is really important for your side art application. Anything that's not perfectly flat, perfectly smooth, you are going to see once the side art is applied. So here we're starting at the bottom again. I've applied solution to the cabinet. I've applied solution to the back of the film. It starts to saturate through. It also, you wind up applying solution to the actual vinyl itself as you're prepping to do the install on it. Trim off your backing. Try and get things squared up as much as you can. And you then can apply your side art. You'll see that I'm also applying some of the rapid tack to the surface of the vinyl as well. And this is so you don't wind up gouging it with your squeegee. If you don't, or if you have a sharp edge on your squeegee, you can actually damage the vinyl during the application. So just please be cautious with this. Now with the base attached, everything kind of lines up well. It really facilitates making it easy to apply the rest of it. You can do it in sections with it. Usually I like to do 12, 18, maybe 24 inches at a time, depending on how much movement there is in the vinyl for it. Just trim off the section that you want. If it's wet enough, you can literally just roll it over. The wonderful thing about the rapid tack is that you can pick it up and reposition it as you need to. So it makes it really easy to make adjustments as you go. As you've seen in the past, I continue to squeegee out the material underneath between the vinyl and the arcade cabinet. I just would note that I'm always amazed at how much better this looks after it dries on day 2. So obviously you have to get all the material out, or the majority of the material out. But if you're in a situation where you feel like, just one more time I can rework this a little bit more and get a little bit more material out, a little bit more of the liquid out, quite often it's not worth the effort. And once it dries, it actually turns out quite nice. All right, so now we're getting ready to wrap the vinyl around the edge. There's lots of different ways of doing this. I know that some of the guys that do this all the time are showing to always use a heat gun and stretch the material. I've had some good and bad luck doing that. I've actually had some of the cheaper vinyl tear on me, and nothing like having to go and tear the vinyl off and start over. So this is what I usually wind up doing with it. This is how I address it for sides where I'm going to have T-molding underneath of it. So usually I wind up doing a fold at the edge of the cabinet, physically just pulling on it a bit and stretching it, wrapping it over. Anywhere there's a corner or motion in the side of the cabinet, I wind up doing little tiny slits that I cut out with a utility knife or something sharp, so I can do those in sections as you're seeing me do here. And then I'll fold it all over and wind up having a nice clean edge on the vinyl. My only real note of caution on this is that if you are going to be using this method, you have to make sure that your T-slot is perfectly centered, or at least that your T-molding is perfectly edged up to the side that has the vinyl on it. Otherwise, you're going to see about a little bit of a tiny lip over, and if you're a perfectionist, it's going to absolutely drive you nuts. If you're working on a cabinet that has black side art, or where the side art is matching the T-molding, even if it is full side art with it, the fold doesn't matter quite as much then with the slot for the T-molding. And this is part of the reason why you saw me earlier paint all of the T-molding as well. When I was originally planning on doing this cabinet, I was planning on using the black leather T-molding, but I did find some blue T-molding that pretty much matches this art beautifully. And so I'm going to be applying that instead in this situation with it. So as you see, I'll continue to work through the edges with it. Really, you can pull on the vinyl fairly well with it. You just have to be careful that you don't pull too hard because it'll actually tear at the crease. If it tears at the crease, it's not the world's worst end. That's why I'm always interested in trying to do a heavier crease, like right there, just because it lets the tear will occur at the crease as opposed to into the side art. If you don't do a very hard crease with your thumb as you go around on it, the chance of it tearing and pulling into the side art is much greater, which then turns into a problem. And here we're just finishing off the side with it. As I mentioned earlier, the straight sections are not a problem with it. The only time you're really cutting into it is when you're doing around the edges with it. And from how I usually like to do this, I tend to cut it off at the T-mold slot in the middle. I know some people actually like to try and tuck it in at the T-mold. And a lot of people actually recommend that you flush cut it at the edge of the cabinet as well. And you do that by holding your cutter at an angle to the T-molding as you go around to get a nice clean edge. But if you can tuck it, that's my preferred method as I'm doing these. All right, so now the fun begins with applying T-molding. So this is always something I enjoy doing. Usually I wind up leaving a little bit of T-molding sticking out of the end, and I'll wind up trimming that up afterwards. Always when you apply T-molding, use a rubber mallet. You also wind up needing to notch the T-molding as you go with it. Some people just beat the T-molding into place, and what happens is over time the T-molding will start to pull away from the cabinet, and you'll wind up getting little kind of like bubbles in the T-molding almost with it. So if you want the T-molding to stick well, the notches is the best way to go. If you have a internal radius with it, you basically wind up having to cut small pie pieces out of the T-molding, so that as it bends into that internal radius, the T part of the molding, the vertical part, comes in contact. If you have a radius going the other direction, basically all you do is cut a notch into the T-molding and it'll bend nicely for you as well. Next, it's time to apply the T-molding across the top. Please cut this before you do that. I do want to note here that there is a groove that you have to cut in for the marquee. It's problematic in that my slot cutter is too big really for the T-molding, not as far as width, but as far as depth. And so as a result, I have to back off the slot for the marquee to sit, which then results in the marquee being tilted back slightly. I need to basically find a less wide slot cutter for the T-molding to get this fixed. If I get these too close, I've had this in the past where I've cut them too close, and then basically the wood blows out at the end. Now it's time to test fit the control panel fit, which is wonderful when it aligns up correctly. You can see the blocking in the corners here. This is basically from the CNC plans. This is why it's important. In this situation, I don't have the metal tabs that all the Taito cabs have for assembling these things. And I'm cheating here by basically installing a wooden block to attach the control panel to, or to lock the control panel into. So what I wind up doing here is you'll see the little holes put into the wood block. They're done through Craig screws. Apply a coat of glue to the back end of it, as I embarrassed myself as I dropped this a few times. And then basically clamp it in place where you want it, and then you can put the Craig screws in. Craig screws will more than put enough pressure into it to have a good, wonderful, tight connection for the glue to dry for you. Once this is in place, you can basically use this as your template for replacing the angle pieces that usually attach the control panel in. And then I'll wind up just drilling holes through these wood blocks essentially with the control panel in place. The process is again repeated on the other side, a little bit more gracefully this time. I would also note that in some occasions these are slightly off from exactly where you want to be, and I usually wind up having some 1/8 inch and 1/16 inch sheet material that I can then wind up using basically as a shim if I need to move things up or down for the control panel. In this case, everything was placed just about perfectly correct, so I didn't have to do any of that. But basically what I'll do is I'll put the blockings in, let them dry thoroughly with it, and then I will glue in a piece of 1/8 inch or 1/16 inch plywood on top that covers both sets of blocking to raise it up. It's always easier to raise up the blocking than to have the blocking too high and have to raise it down. So just as you're building your cabinets, try to focus on making sure your blocking is low enough so that you can adjust it as needed later. So with the blocking installed and dry, basically the next thing is to drill the holes for the control panel. And basically all you wind up doing is setting a control panel on top, drilling a hole through where it needs to go, and then I wind up usually using wing nuts on this to make sure it attaches nice and neat. So once that is done, you can dry fit your control panel in, all your holes line up, hopefully, and you now have a nice solid connection for your control panel. All right, so next we're installing the side channels, and this is going to hold the monitor glass and the bezel for the monitor. This is a aftermarket reproduction part. I honestly can't remember where I got it, but I got a bunch of them many, many years ago. This is one of the few parts you truly need to find somewhere. It's not something that you can easily replicate or replace like you could with the blocking for the control panel. This piece will hold your bezel and your monitor glass. And the bezel is also something you'll have to find uniquely for this cabinet. All right, so looking at the bezel here, these are old, and I'm not aware of anyone that's doing reproductions on these, and they're rather thin as well. What I like to do for fixing these, because every single one I've always had is broken, is black glue sticks. They're wonderful things. And basically what you can do is you can go around the edges where you have any of your cracks in the material, and the black glue sticks magically put everything back together. The black material, if it does seep through, meaning you have a crack or you have something that's a chip that's missing out of it, the black glue stick will fill it in beautifully for you. They're strong, they're flexible. It's the best way to fix these things. That's how I've been doing it for a couple years now. I would note that once you start using black glue sticks, that's going to be the purpose of that glue gun, so you're not going to be able to put regular ones through it afterwards. But if you spend your time and line up all the pieces beforehand before you put your glue sticks in, all the cracks that you have in these magically disappear, and it looks just about new again. So like I said, recommendation for fixing bezels. All right, for this next part, I really don't have much in good video for you, but you're going to wind up having to glue some blocking in to support the frame that holds the monitor. The blocking that I'm putting in here is pre-cut. This matches up with what I had on the CNC files. It's made of melamine as well. The thing I would note here is that melamine does not adhere well to melamine using regular glue. You have to use special glue for attaching melamine pieces to melamine pieces. In this case, roux glue. So if you are going to be doing this, please make sure you're paying attention to it and use the correct material to do it. Otherwise, you may wind up having some type of catastrophic failure down the road. All right, so the monitor frame that I had for my build plans, well, it just had to be recut. It just didn't line up rightly with it. So if you are doing that, make sure you note that. You'll see that I put the Craig screws on the bottom side here. So while the frame does sit on that piece of melamine that I glued in with it, the Craig screws are basically aligned and will support the frame on the bottom side, which is what gives you your strength. You can then slide your monitor in from the top, from the front essentially of the cabinet, and then adjust it as you need to. Here I'm pointing to the two different paths essentially for the monitor bezel and the monitor shroud. The monitor shroud being the lower one. You also want to make sure that as you're aligning these, that you're not interfering with this top piece of material where the speaker is mounted, so you can get everything to slide in earlier, easier later. So here we're sliding in the monitor shroud with it, and as it goes down and forward with it, you'll see it will have to flex to make it over top of the curvature of the monitor. This is why these all break over time as they get brittle and old. The other thing to note here is that the spacing on this is almost dead on. It's maybe off by about 1/2 inch. So if you're truly attention to detail oriented here, you could possibly raise the monitor maybe another 1/4 to 1/2 inch to get a little bit of a tighter fit around the monitor shroud. But in general, this is a pretty darn tight fit. And this is really nice to see because it confirms that the plans and the spacing for everything is done correctly. So in this case, I've decided this is close enough. Once you wind up putting the monitor glass over top of it, it's going to be close enough that you're not going to have to do any adjustments on it. Here we wind up having the monitor glass over it, and you can see that the monitor glass is a bit too low. I actually wind up putting in some blocking at the bottom to get the monitor glass to stop in the correct location. This will also shim up the monitor shroud as well. So you will have some fine tuning to do once the two are in place. You'll also note that when I installed the monitor earlier, it was installed with screws. This was done intentionally because it allows me to adjust the screws up and down as I need to, so that I can move the monitor up or down into position a little bit better over top of the monitor shroud. But as you can see, it's pretty darn close. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to focus too much on power and wiring. This power block is actually out of another Atari cabinet, just something that I had lying around. The reason that I like to keep these power blocks around is because they have isolation transformers for your monitors with it, and they usually have easy wiring going out to your switching power supply as well. So just something to be aware of. A note, if you are going to be using a real monitor, you must make sure you understand what's going on with the need for an isolation transfer beforehand. Extremely dangerous if you're not using one, you're supposed to be using one. From here, I'm basically just taking the AC out from the power block and going into my switching power supply. I always get irritated when people just shove wires under connectors with it, so please crimp, please solder, please make correct corrections when you're going to power. Since I'm using a J-Rock in this case, wiring is standard JAMA, which makes it pretty easy and simple. Alright, so this is the J-Rock board. It's a standard JAMA board. I would like to note that this is a FPGA board, so it's kind of the next evolution up between emulation and original hardware. There's a whole pile of videos out there that explain what the difference is between emulation, FPGA, and original hardware. So if you have an interest, go take a look. For this board, the only thing I would note is that you see that I usually put the connector, the JAMA connector, facing up. This is just a me thing. And you'll also see that I usually secure the JAMA connector with the extra screws and the rubber bands on it. For me, I found that over the years, I've had a bunch of these JAMA connectors come loose as I'm moving a machine around in the game room, and then it winds up shorting out the boards. So I found that usually if I mount the JAMA connector facing up, I have less of this occurring, and then the rubber bands are just kind of a little bit of an extra reinforcement to make sure that nothing moves and I don't wind up having any problems down the road. Well, I know I've skipped a few parts. This basically brings us to the end of the assembly. So taking a look at the side art turned out quite beautiful. So it's wonderful when you have good working product to start with, and then you take your time and you apply it and things turn out well. I still have some fine tuning to do on this install. There's a few things that aren't quite right. So the monitor glass, for example, is a little bit too low. I still haven't trimmed off the back of the T-molding on the back of the cabinet. And some other touch-up things here and there, but overall, very happy with the outcome of the game. All right, everyone, we've made it to the end of the video. Overall, I think the project has turned out quite well. I still have some adjustments to do, but I'm pretty darn close. If you have any questions about the process, please add them to the comments. Also looking to see what type of video I'm going to be doing next. I have a video series I'm working on how to trace cabinets. That's it for all. Thank you for watching.